Welcome to this week's History Chat, brought to you by Retrospect History. Today we are delving into one of the most extreme episodes of the Reformation, specifically the time that Münster came under Anabaptist rule. Now you might have some questions, like what is a Münster, who are Anabaptists, and what did their rule look like? Let's jump right in. Münster is a quiet university town numbering some 300,000 people that is located in the northwest corner of Germany, near the Dutch border. Like a lot of other German towns, it looks peaceful on the surface, but is built on layers of gruesome violence. In 1525, Münster was in many ways a typical European city, surrounded by a thick wall and not very clean. It existed in a world that was very much not at peace. In the face of constant warfare, so very typical of Europe in this time, the nobility took to taxing common people more and more, until they were left with barely enough to survive. Confronted with such an urgent threat to their livelihood, the commoners of Münster rose up, no doubt inspired by a massive peasant revolt happening at the same time in southern Germany. The peasants in the south rose up due to the same reasons that made people in Münster unhappy: high taxes and awful treatment. The peasant revolt would be brutally put down. Almost 100,000 peasants died. In fact, their demands would not really be met until the 19th century at the earliest, but their movement lived on, underground. This had much to do with something else that was going on at the same time, namely the Protestant Reformation. The main vibe of the Reformation, as preached by Martin Luther starting in 1517, was a rejection of the Catholic Church, which claimed to be the sole authority able to correctly interpret the Bible. Luther thought that all believers should instead be trusted to read the Bible for themselves. While this kind of thinking may have helped to inspire the peasant uprisings in the first place, most mainstream Protestants turned their backs on such movements. Protestants like Luther did not want to destroy the social hierarchy of their times, just change it a bit to fit their personal beliefs. In the very early days of the Reformation, then, little was certain. Every preacher that agreed with Luther's complaints in principle had their own idea as to what should be done about it, and one of those people was Thomas Münzer. He led the peasants in their great uprising because he began to believe that the end of the world was approaching, and that he should help the common Christian and the evil of nobility. The righteous would survive and advance to a much better state of existence after the second coming of Christ. Honestly, this was not too outrageous of a claim. Many people believed that a date for the end of the world could be calculated based off information found in the Bible, and the schism in the church made people think that, it was about to happen. Münzer failed. But some of the peasants who survived joined the Anabaptist faith, which was a really good fit for them because one of the things that it preached was sharing material goods, very much in the vibe of what the peasants wanted in the first place. The Anabaptist faith itself originated from Switzerland. There, also in 1525, certain members of Protestant communities around Zurich started insisting on adult baptisms, which is where the term Anabaptist really comes from in the first place. In essence, they just wanted people to make the conscious choice to join Christianity when they were old enough to do so, instead of everyone being in it by default. And they thought that logically this would make religious life much better. And those who did make that choice would then live in a much more closely knit community where goods and money were shared. The adult baptisms were really a bigger problem than egalitarian thinking for both mainstream Protestants and Catholics, because it was just incompatible with how they viewed Christian society. Essentially, they thought that to get into heaven, it was not enough to just be personally good. Your entire community had to be united in their faith to avoid damnation. Heresy, as in non-mainstream thinking, was a disease and a threat that could spread and contaminate society. Being tolerant in itself was seen as letting God and Jesus down. Anabaptism became punishable by death in 1529, but all that the Anabaptists thought they were doing was practicing religion as they thought it was practiced in the very early days, kind of immediately after Jesus. Let's recap what you've hit so far. Münster was a typical German town, which meant going through a lot of suffering. In 1525, the commoners rose up, but their wishes were ignored. At the same time, the Anabaptist version of Christianity was being created. It was not afraid to combine religious with social questions, but it was far from uniform and led by preachers who kept saying that the end of the world was about to arrive. Seen as a threat by all sides of the religious divide due to its, emphasis on being voluntary, it never saw widespread support, instead surviving through loose networks of believers visited by wandering prophets, until 1533. Prophets are people who are full of themselves. I mean, they kind of have to be if they can convince people that God literally lives inside of them and informs their thoughts. The line between a prophet and a demagogue is thin, and often it is crossed. Thomas Münzer led the peasants and their cause was just, but he did it because of his own convictions about the approaching end of the world. Also, he didn't just want to help, he made himself their leader. His attempt ended with disaster and 100,000 dead. So what do you think happens when a half-formed ideology meets a demagogue who has no just cause? That demagogue was Jan Matthys, a Dutch baker from Haarlem. He quickly rose to prominence within the local Anabaptist circle once the previous prophet's prediction that the Day of Judgment would occur in November 1533 did not pan out. He quickly looked for ways to expand his own influence and struck gold when he heard what was happening in Münster. So what was happening in Münster? Well, Bernd Rothmann, a preacher, was trying as hard as he could to spread the Anabaptist faith in town. He was not successful initially, but he won new converts from the ranks of the local craftsmen and commoners, which he supported in a protest, making use of the obvious connection between Anabaptism and socioeconomic demands. He won sympathizers from every corner of society, and though the town council tried shutting him down for a while, by January 1534, they had given up and declared a policy of tolerance in regards to religion. Matthys heard of the fight that Rothmann was leading and winning and felt like he had to get in on this whole Münster thing. He scoped out the exact state of affairs, trying to decide if Münster was where the second coming of Christ was supposed to take place. He went for it. I mean, after all, why shouldn't Christ come back in some small German town? He made it to Münster, also in January 1534, with his bro and apostle, Jan of Leyden, where he was received with great warmth by the local Anabaptist community, who saw in him the prophet that he claimed to be. From this point on, the pace starts picking up. Matthys sets Easter of that same year as Judgment Day. Being among the chosen ones helps polarize Münster's society in favor of supporting the prophet. Anabaptists outside of Münster, from as far away as Amsterdam, come to town to ride out the end of the world. The 23rd of February sees an election for town council in which 23 of 24 candidates are Anabaptists. So is the new mayor, the delightfully named Bernd Knipperdollink. With Anabaptists holding the reins of power within the city, non-believers and dissidents in general are exiled on the 27th of February. In March, the situation deteriorates further. In preparation for Judgment Day, all books in town that are not the Bible are burned. Any threats to Anabaptist control are dealt with viciously. Matthys shoots a random blacksmith who dared criticize him in front of the entire town council, who do nothing. Private ownership of property is abolished in keeping with Anabaptist ideology, though it remains unclear if this property was in any way redistributed or if it was just seized by the Anabaptist regime, as its leaders, coincidentally became quite wealthy at the same exact time. Churches were stripped of what was viewed as decadent and Catholic art. Municipal archives destroyed. The closer that Easter Sunday came, the more the town seemed to drown in a state of terror and ecstasy. But the Anabaptists were about to meet their match. Münster was part of a small realm that was governed by a bishop, Franz von Waldeck. He had tried to mostly stay out of the affairs of this town because he was trying to pull off his own scheme. Although he was a high-ranking member of the Catholic Church, being a bishop, he was planning on converting to Protestantism and declaring the realm his own personal, inheritable property. The radicalism of the Anabaptists, though, within the town was not really his cup of tea, and so he set out to restore order. Just before Easter Sunday, his forces enveloped the city, leaving it in a state of siege. The regime within the walls was obviously not going to take this lying down. On Easter Sunday, Jan Matthys and some 12 followers left the city and headed for the enemy lines. In front of hundreds who dotted the city walls to try and catch a glimpse of their prophet. He was gunned down by soldiers of the bishop. Either he hoped that Jesus would appear in that moment and save his life, or he knew that staying in town after his prophecy would have failed to come true would mean death at the hands of his now betrayed followers. Either way, things were not going to get better. Jan of Leiden took over the leadership of the Anabaptists of Münster. He knew that unless he moved quickly, things would fall apart now that the prophesied second coming of Christ failed to materialize. The religious solution that he and Bernd Rothmann proposed was thus, that yes, Judgment Day had failed to materialize, but if we double down on our faith, we can drive out the other heretics and establish a great Anabaptist state that will deal with things until Jesus does come back. And to build this state, Jan was crowned King of New Jerusalem. As king, he lived in luxury while being in a besieged city. Remember what I said about private property being abolished? It really does seem like it was repossessed. He was not going to be a gentle ruler. The death penalty was expanded to include various sins and moral violations. He personally carried out many of the executions, including that of one of his 17 wives. Or 16. Definitely vastly more than one. Why? Well, due to a variety of factors, there were 3 women for every man in Münster when the siege began. To control this part of the population, Jan and his pals thought that all these women should be made subservient to one man or another through marriage, and in July allowed polygamy in town due to the imbalance of men and women. While the motivation was, disgusting to begin with, it was made worse by his insistence that women did not have the right to say no to any proposal made to them. Jan himself also looked to strengthen his position within the town after the death of Matthys by marrying his widow. But he already had a wife, so, polygamy was a way out for him. I don't know how he got from 2 wives to 16 or 17, though. And the wife that he executed? Well, allegedly she criticized the luxury he was living in while the city was suffering from siege and terror. And as any well-adjusted person would think, the correct reaction to being confronted like this was off with her head. At this point, we should really be asking ourselves if what was happening in Münster was real Anabaptism. Most Anabaptists of this time probably did not share the same beliefs as the people in Münster did. Since it was meant to be kind of selective and separate from the rest of society, its members were actually encouraged to refrain from participating in state structures altogether and to actually be pacifist. Executing people and wanting to conquer the world, that's not pacifist, no matter how you slice it. At the same time, the power players within Münster were associated through pretty direct links to the rest of the movement. Many of the things that they did, even the crazier stuff like believing in the imminent end of the world, were not really incompatible with the core elements of the Anabaptist faith. Personally, it seems to me that this is a relatively classic example of idealistic thinking that is unable to deal with the reality of everyday life and, governance. I think that Münster could be emblematic for what a large Anabaptist community would have been like at this time, no matter who was making the decisions. But this is not some major indictment against them. I have little doubt that with time, large Anabaptist communities would find ways to build stable societies. In fact, the largest Anabaptist communities today are probably the Amish, and I'm sure you can find something to criticize about the Amish, but I doubt that they are executing people or preparing for the end of the world or something. The bigger problem with how this episode of history is seen and portrayed is propaganda. I'm probably guilty of this too. I mean, I have made it seem like what was happening in Münster was some particularly horrible event. A fake king of a small town with 17 wives that preaches the end of the world and, executes people personally. Don't get me wrong. People outside of Münster were outraged by everything that was happening. Martin Luther was horrified by it and published writings attacking the Anabaptists. And, Holy Roman Emperor Charles V contemplated how to resolve the issue. I mean, after all, he was the one who introduced the death penalty for Anabaptism. But it was so hated by Catholics and Protestants alike because it was a massive media event. By the early 16th century, the printing press had reached such a widespread level of adoption that people all across, at least the Holy Roman Empire could keep up with events happening in Münster on a regular basis. Needless to say, the pieces written by mostly Catholic and Lutheran authors were not always very factual. But since so much was being written about Münster by seemingly so many different people, these writings gave normal people every excuse to be mad. Propaganda is very old, and it has stuck around because it works. And the most important element of propaganda is repetition. So until about 50 years ago, even academic writing on Münster was heavily influenced by the image of events that was painted in people's minds all the way back in the 1530s. Since then, we have found out that Anabaptism had approximately even levels of support through all classes of the population. Even if commoners played a part in getting Anabaptism established in Münster, this was in no way some proletariat revolution against the wealthy patricians of the city. There is also the fact that the distribution of wealth remained approximately the same before and after Anabaptist rule, suggesting that whatever was done to allegedly abolish private property was probably a lot less extreme than what you might think. Ultimately, the propaganda goes so deep that we might never even get to the heart of the matter. What does seem safe to say, though, is that Jan of Leiden, or any other person involved, was not particularly cruel or crazy for his time. The list of crimes committed by agents of every religion and realm in Europe at this time would be so long that it would crash my computer if I tried to open it, or, even compose it in the first place. I think it's time that we learned how this whole thing ends. In late 1534 and early 1535, multiple attempts were made by both sides to break the stalemate. The Anabaptists sent agents out of the town to hopefully inspire similar events in other towns, but they were all caught and executed. The bishop, Franz von Waldeck, tried to take the town multiple times, but the walls were just too thick. While many within the city held out in hope of an imminent coming of Christ, others had become too weakened by starvation to keep faith. By May of 1535, the situation was critical. One of the men to flee the city made the decision to rat out the Anabaptists and shared the location of weak points in the city wall. On the 24th of June, 1535, the Anabaptist rule of Münster ended. The soldiers of the bishop broke through the wall at one of the weak points. After 2 days of slaughter, 650 Anabaptist men lay dead. All women had to either renounce their faith or be exiled immediately. Almost all major leaders were either killed or imprisoned. It was now time for a show trial and executions. The three main leaders that the bishop had taken alive were Jan of Leiden himself, the mayor Knipperdolling, and the king's prime minister, a man called Bernd Krechting. After refusing to turn their back on their religion, on the 22nd of January, 1536, they were led to the main market square in Münster and onto a large wooden platform in front of a huge crowd of onlookers. First, their tongues were ripped out by hot irons and then those irons, along with other torture instruments, were used to rip their bodies to pieces. They remained alive through all this for 4 hours, until they were finally stabbed to death. Their bodies were hung up in 3 separate cages on St. Lambert's Church. The original cages still hang from the church today, reminding everyone that Münster is now and forever a Catholic city. If the people who killed Jan of Leiden were capable of the same exact horrific violence he himself embraced, then I don't see how Münster was in any way some anomaly in 16th century Europe. It was just business as usual, as sad as that is. Thank you for listening to this week's History Chat. Let me know about what you thought of the Anabaptists and this little episode of history in general. Follow me to keep track of what I will do next. See you soon.